In her collection of essays, Teaching a Stone to Talk, writer Annie Dillard tells of some failed expeditions to polar regions. Some of the groups that she writes of did make it to their destinations, but more than those that made it, many failed to make it very long or very far in the harsh environs of the polar ice. Illness, madness, starvation, and of course exposure claimed many lives of those who had set out from their homes with such high hopes of seeing exciting things. But even more than the elements, some of them were done in by their own flawed planning and packing for the journey that they set out upon. Time after time, ships set out from port to much fanfare and huge crowds cheering these explorers who were going out to do something that few people would even dream of doing. But then these explorers soon found themselves trapped in ice floes, and they discovered that things like backgammon sets and fancy crystal and dress uniforms just weren't all that useful in the realities and the real world of polar exploring. Many of these unfortunate guys were not discovered until much later because, of course, they had to be thawed out before people could find them where they had wandered. And what was found there held some valuable lessons. For instance, some of the men who were found, or at least what was left of them, were found months later with silver settings tucked into their coats, or holding on to fancy pieces of polished metal with their family crest engraved on it. Even in the face of death on the ice, they apparently couldn't imagine leaving behind these trappings of luxury, or at least these things that were reminders of the life that they had left behind. They lacked the sustenance even to stay alive, but at least they didn't die without the engraved flask. You've got to have your priorities even when you're dying in an ice storm. I wonder at what point these guys began to think how different this reality is from the books that they'd read and the lectures that they'd heard that motivated them to leave it all behind and go off in search of something exciting. I wonder how tempting it was to get back on the boat and decide that being able to see ice was good enough. I think we're faced with that same type of challenge as the church today. We're called to follow Jesus wherever he may lead us. But it can be really hard to face the realities of that calling and to embrace the difficulties and the challenges that it may bring for us. We want to move forward, but it's hard to let go of what we have known. We want to see new lands, but it's frightening to get out of sight of the ship that we've sailed on that's gotten us to where we are. And if we are not careful, and we're not intentional in our obedience, we may find ourselves tempted to just stay in sight of what God has promised, but unwilling to take those last few hard steps to get us there. In our Old Testament reading today, the Israelites were in that same type of place. They'd been on a long, hard journey. They were headed toward what they believed God had promised to them, and it had taken them 40 years of wandering in the desert to get to the place where we find them today. And the journey, if you've read the story, you know, did not start out well. After God finds Moses in the desert and tells him that his job is to go and lead these people out of captivity, and after a little bit of very one-sided bargaining, Moses goes and gets the people and brings them out, and almost immediately, these freed slaves begin complaining, wishing that they had just been left where they were. It wasn't good in Egypt, but at least they knew what to expect. At least they could have died in what had been their home for all this time. Almost immediately, they find themselves facing a body of water with an army behind them. Needless to say, the journey did not start off easy. And over again throughout this journey, they struggled with the reality, and they forgot the promises toward which they were moving. They may not have insisted on carrying around the family silver settings, but they certainly did carry around plenty of other baggage that weighted them down. Once even deciding that anything visible was better than what they knew, and convincing Moses' brother to build them an idol, a God they could see. They just kept forgetting the promises, just kept struggling with the reality of where they were going. But through all of this, God's promises were real. And once those who had failed to embrace that and follow that had died off, finally they were able to arrive at the land that had been promised. They find themselves just across the river from the land of promise. And the river was flooded. But of course it was. The journey started with what seemed to be an unmanageable crossing. And this next chapter was going to begin the same way. And at this point in the story, we find Joshua having taken over as the leader of the people. After Moses died, Joshua was elevated into that position of leadership. And in these first 3 chapters of the book of Joshua, we see him being established in that role with God and in the eyes of people, and even maybe for himself, coming to understand who he was and the job that he had been given. And now here he finds himself facing a flooded river with a lot of people behind him, waiting to see what's going to happen. In the verses before we started reading today, Joshua tells the people that they are to sanctify themselves and get ready to move, because God is going to work wonders among them. He tells the priests to get ready to move out with the Ark of the Covenant in front of the people, and they are to march in front, but not too close. Now, the Ark was the box that represented God's very presence with them. On the top of it was the seat that represented God's throne for them. These were people who for 40 years had no home. The Ark of the Covenant was what represented for them who they were. What they had to hold on to in this journey was that God journeyed with them, and the Ark was the reminder, the evidence of that. So what the priests were being asked to do that day was no small thing, was it? They were to pick up the Ark, the very symbol of who they are, and walk out into a flooded river with that. The promise was that once they were in the water would stop flowing upstream and everybody could go across. But what if it didn't happen? What if the flood didn't stop? The priests, the Ark could be washed away and lost forever. And that's the hard truth. Sometimes the call of God is not easy. The choice that they faced at that point was to decide if it was going to be enough to live in the shadow of the promise, in view of what could have been, if that was going to be enough, or if by faith they were going to send this very symbol of their identity out into a flooded river. Sometimes, we have to make a decision like that too. We know what God has called us to do. We hear God beckoning us to wade in, to go deeper, and we hear the promise of what we will find there. That's why I'm here today. Because of that. But often we settle for living next to faithfulness, in view of the promise. That's why it took me 12 years to get here. The problem with us making that decision of settling for living in view of the land of promise is that that choice leaves us on the desert side of the river. And we have to decide to take those last few steps. I suspect that most of you can relate to that. You know something about the desert, both individually and as a body, corporately here. But here you are, here we are, and we're being invited to join God on a journey to something that is more than we have known. And it may cost us. And it may ask more of us than we think we can do. Part of the difficulty of following God's call is that we so often want to know how it's going to end before we're willing to start out, right? We know it doesn't work that way, and in other parts of our life we're willing to just step out and do things and know that it's going to happen and come through the way it's supposed to, but for some reason it's so easy when we sense God calling us to deeper places and asking us to lay things on the line that we think we can't live without, to either freeze or just refuse to do it. I'd say that's just too much. If I don't know the end, I'm not going to start. But here's what I have really had to wrestle with that I've always known, but that I believe to now to be true more often than not, and that is that the confirmation is almost always going to follow the obedience. The call of God doesn't give us the assurance ahead of time, does it? We have to take those steps. When God found Moses in the desert and told him that his job was going to be to go to Egypt and to bring the people out, Moses says, well, who am I to go? And God's response is, I will go with you, and here's how you will know it. Once you've done all that I've told you to do, and you've brought the people back to this mountain, you will worship here. And by that, you'll know that it was me who sent you. Now, that's great confirmation, but that is well after the fact of the obedience. Go do all of this stuff, and when you make it back here, you'll know. How does he know at that point? By looking back and seeing it through every step. God has walked with him. When the priest had to step into the water that day, the Bible tells us that the flood waters piled up, well upstream, and the people crossed over on dry land. Scholars have speculated that it was that they spread out over a mile of that river, walking across on dry land. Picture that. The confirmation came. God did exactly what God said, but the confirmation came only after the obedience. And with that, Joshua then is established as the leader, and they step out and they begin to move across, and start their conquest of their new homeland. And that would be an interesting adventure tale if that's all there was to it, right? But the crossing was about something even bigger than that. Because what was being confirmed for them that day was not that they could get through the river. Not even that they could get a new homeland. Joshua tells the people that through their obedience, what they would come to know was that the living God was among them. And ultimately, that's all they needed to know. God had been among them all along, leading and protecting and providing through 40 years in the desert. But here, once more, they got to be reminded in a big way that this was still true. Which brings me back to us. I know that I feel like these last few years have been a lot more desert than necessary, mostly because I chose to be there. But here today is an opportunity to take some steps of faith and to grasp the truth that as we journey, as we step out together, that the living God is among us. That's what has always mattered most, and what we need to experience and hold on to. So if that's what matters most, how can we know this? Well, the confirmation follows the obedience. So we will know that God is among us this way. We'll know it when we answer the call of God to do something that seems impossible. And trust that when we get through it, we will look back and see that God was with us the whole way as we worship together on that mountain where it all started. We'll know it when we step into flooded rivers, carrying things that likely can't be replaced and that have identified us for so long. And trust that when God says the waters will stop, they'll stop. We'll know it when we stop resisting that call that has nagged at us for years and let go of something important. And trust that God will provide. We'll know it when we embrace the unexpected, when we answer the call, acknowledge the cost, pack for the journey, and set out for a land that we will know when we see it. We will know that God is among us when we refuse to settle for living across the river from God's promise. The confirmation will come, but it will follow our obedience. The water will stop, but not until we get our feet wet. The living God is known and experienced on this journey in the midst of our obedience and our trust. And so, church, as we begin our journey together today, may we trust together that God journeys with us. May we know that the living God is among us. May we not be afraid to get our feet